wine, which he was making some of the greatest wines in the world, but also under unique, deplorable conditions of a civil war. And he made the wine every single year during the Civil War. And there are more stories about Marc Hochar and Chateau Musar. I could talk personally for 4 hours non-stop, and you'd still be actually interested, which is an amazing thing. Usually I can speak for 10 minutes and I'm boring everyone, but on Chateau Musar, it's just an amazing story. But my history of Musar never ended after that, because when I was 20, I moved to Montreal and I worked for Shenley, which was the agency for Chateau Musar in Canada. And after a year, I moved to Toronto. And my job was looking after the suppliers when they came into town. I was a wine consultant. And Marc Hochar came in frequently, and I got to know him extremely well. He became like my second father over the next few years. And we thought alike, we had a lot in common, but bizarrely because of our age differences. And then I went to Vancouver and introduced Chateau Musar there. Eventually, after about 5 years, I moved to San Francisco to start a company called Premium Port Wines for the Symingtons. And there, I happened to set up by sharing an office with the Hill-Smith family at Negociants. And it happened that they were the importer of Chateau Musar for the US. So my relationship with Serge continued. We kept seeing each other all the time. And then in 1996, I set up my own company, Broadbent Selections, and Serge said he'd love to move the wine to us. He'd already left Negociants by then. He'd gone to Premier Wine Merchants, which was a division of Rémy Martin. But they were not doing a great job for him, and he wanted to move to us. But he had the sense of knowing that most companies don't survive past the first year. So he waited a year or so, and then he moved over to us. So we've represented the brand since about 1998, I would say. And yeah, and not only do I love the wine so much that when I got married in 1996, the only red wine that I had at both my wedding and my rehearsal dinner was Chateau Musar, and I think it was the 88 vintage, if I remember correctly. Wow. So yeah, so my love of Musar is continuing. I give lectures about it all the time. Marc took over from his dad maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but I'd been working with Marc on and off before that. And Marc has seamlessly taken on the mantle of running Chateau Musar and talking about it around the world. And so it's really exciting to have him here today on this call.
Yeah, well, wait. Perfect time to have him come in. Marc, without any further ado, Marc Hochar from Chateau Musar.
Hello. Hi, Max.
Hey,
Hello.
Marc. I just suddenly remembered, I forgot to mention that your wife is called Broadbent, and it goes without saying that she's stunningly beautiful, not just because you married her, but because she's a Broadbent.
I'm sure that's the reason.
But no immediate connection, but it's a funny coincidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here to join your Bottles Up seminar.
And where are you right now? Are you in Germany or
yes,
Paris,
I'm based in Germany. Yes, and so this is happening for me late at night, but this is what I've done already for the US markets. It makes sense to do it that way. The benefits, I guess, of being locked up is that we can actually spend a lot of time at home, and then we can work from home, and we're all set up to do it all the time, I guess.
And you've given me the most fabulous excuse to drink 2010 vintage Chateau Musar at 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah, well, cheers. I'm on the 08, so cheers. Max also.
Yes, cheers. Cheers to you all.
Good.
Cheers, Max.
Cheers, Balu. So let's have a few questions for you, Marc, and to kind of, or more than a few questions, but before we kind of delve into Chateau Musar, can you kind of give us a history of wine in Lebanon? to kind of give some depth and background to the winery.
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can't talk about Musar without really talking about the region. The region has been producing wines for many centuries, actually thousands of years. The beginning of wine started in Mesopotamia, which is roughly current Iran, Iraq, Georgia, Turkey area, and that dates back to roughly 8,000 years ago. Eventually, wine made its way through to the Middle East and arrived in our part of the world around 6,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And the real contribution, I guess, of Lebanon was the contribution of the Lebanese, of the Phoenicians, who were the ancestors of the Lebanese, because of their not only the way that produced wines, they developed their own techniques, but mostly they used to produce and also sell wines across all of the Mediterranean. And they used to be good at trade. They used to have their boats. And would eventually sell wines to the pharaohs, eventually to what would become Greece, to what would become Europe of today. And this is how wine went from, I guess, the Middle East to what is now Europe over the course of many thousands of years. Yeah. And so their contribution has been tremendous. If you fast forward a few thousand years, you get to the period of Jesus Christ. You're like 2,000 years ago. The Roman Empire used to control all of the Middle East and all of the Mediterranean, and through that they used to build temples for the different gods, and they decided to build the only temple dedicated to Bacchus, god of wine, in Lebanon, actually in the Bekaa Valley, which is where we are now planting our grapes and our vineyards. And so there's been a history of winemaking in the region that's been quite long.
Yeah. So with that, there's a long framework, a lot of time. Could you talk about the land a little bit? What the geography and the climate and all of that?
Yes. What I'll do is let me just do what I need to open a map, and that will be probably the best thing to be able to share with you. Share screen. Where is it? Voila, here it is. Voila. So here we are. I hope you can see this.
Yeah.
And so this is a map of Lebanon. I'll try to use my different stuff. So this is the Mediterranean Sea. I hope you can see this. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Wait, let me just put it in red. And then you have Syria, which is on our east and to the north of Lebanon, Israel to the south. And Lebanon is a tiny country, actually 200 kilometers long, so 120 miles long, and roughly 30 miles wide. So really small, with two chains of mountains running north to south. The first one is in the middle of the country, the Mount Lebanon Range. And the second one is the Mount Anti-Lebanon Range, which is the border with Syria. And these two mountains go up to roughly 10,000 feet, which is extremely high given the small width of the country. And between these two mountain ranges, you have, and let me see if this is going to work. Voila, this area, which is the Bekaa Valley. So the Bekaa Valley is roughly at 3,000 feet of altitude. It's located between two chains of mountains that are extremely high. So it's effectively a microclimate. It is Mediterranean because we're obviously close to the Mediterranean Sea, but because of the altitude and the fact that you have two mountains that protect from the sea. This mountain protects the Bekaa Valley from the sea. This mountain with the border with Syria protects the Bekaa Valley from the desert. So it's a microclimate that's between Mediterranean and almost continental. It's exposed to wind, it's exposed to mostly a lot of snow during the winter and heat in the summer. Long nights, long days of sun with cool nights because of the altitude, and therefore actually ideal conditions to grow vines. And so this is actually, let me take another color. If I take blue, this is Baalbek. So this is where the Romans built the temple of Bacchus, god of wine, in the Bekaa Valley. And so that's where the history, I guess, of winemaking has been so strong, and that I've talked about earlier.
Yeah. So it really is a kind of an agricultural paradise in many ways, like a true Mediterranean agricultural paradise.
Exactly. Actually, okay. Now this is where I need to figure out how to get rid of eraser. Oops. Okay, let me stop share, and then I'll get you to share another screen. Nope. We'll get there. Voila. So here, where's my function? Oops, sorry.
No problem.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
Yeah, we'll get there.
Voila. So here you can see actually a picture of the Bekaa Valley. It's interesting because you see obviously the mountains. You have to understand that this area in the center, which is the green pastures with the soil, is actually at an altitude of roughly 3,000 feet. Okay. And obviously the mountains go up to 10,000 feet, hence the snow. And you can see it's a very green land. It's a lot of clay and limestone. And as you get closer to the foothills of the mountains, actually, you get a bit less water, a bit more limestone, so even better conditions in order to grow our vineyards. And so our vineyards will typically tend to be not in the center of the valley, but probably around the edges, as just at the sides or at the steps of the foothills.
Perfect. So now that you've brought in the lay of the land and the history of Lebanon itself, really, obviously a perfect location for viticulture and making wine. What drove your grandfather to start the winery? What was his the inspiration to start Chateau Musar?
Yeah, so my grandfather. So our name is French. Probably dates back to Crusaders who came to the area probably 400 or 500 years ago. We don't know because it's difficult to track our name. The information has been lost when the Ottoman Empire, disintegrated in 1918. But we've always spoken French. Arabic is the main language of the country, but there's always been also a French culture. And so my grandfather actually went to France to study medicine in the 1915, 1918, and actually early 1920s. Eventually came back to Lebanon, didn't really enjoy medicine, but enjoyed wine. And because Lebanon was born in the 1920s, and was under what was called a French mandate, i.e. the French were posted in the whole Levant area to help set up all the different governments in the region, control them, and eventually we got our independence. But so the French army was posted there, and they needed wine. My father had enjoyed wine in France, so he decided to start the winery. He decided to start it actually with vineyards that he planted and worked with farmers to plant in the Bekaa Valley. But the winery itself was located on the coastal side of the mountain. So I'll share the map. So if you see here, where's the annotation? Voila. This is where actually the winery is located, whereas the vineyards are located in the Bekaa Valley. So it's a 3-hour truck drive. And the reason he chose to have the winery there was because it was located in the cellars of an old castle called the Musar Castle. That was the origin of the name Musar. And the castle was owned by his cousin. So there was an opportunity actually to use that space. And eventually, 30 years later, as the winery grew, and our production requirements grew, he actually bought a house next to it, and this is where the new or current winery exists. And when I say new, I mean it was built in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So there was further expansion. And so this is what explains the distance that we have between the winery itself and the vineyards, which are roughly a 3-hour truck drive. And it's that truck drive actually that determined a lot of the, I guess, the characteristics of our vintages during the war, because it was difficult sometimes to carry the grapes from the vineyards to the winery. And that truck drive effectively either happened early or late compared to normal harvest times, was either short or longer. And that determined a lot of the characteristics of some of our vintages during the 70s and the 80s. Until today, it actually has an impact, I guess, in terms of how probably it helps inoculate our grapes to some form of oxidation, because I guess they are transported in open air trucks under the sun for 3 hours before they reach the winery.
And that is in part too. Chateau Musar is made all with ambient native yeasts, right? So that like it starts naturally and it falls into kind of your father's philosophy. And if we can kind of delve back for a second, could you talk about your father and how he got involved with the winery, and really, if you talk about a visionary person, foreseeing the natural wine movement, organic viticulture, all of these things, is truly remarkable person.
Yeah, so it's when my father joined, I guess, the winery, that was in the late 50s. In 59, actually, well, my father and my uncle used to work as toddlers in the winery and help clean bottles, etc. And then eventually when he was 20, he started getting more involved. At the time, my grandfather asked him to help him a bit more permanently at the winery. And my father refused. So he told him no. And my grandfather asked twice. And then the third time, eventually my father said yes, but you'll have to leave. So what he meant by leave, he meant effectively, you'll have to let me do what I think we should do with the wines. Yeah. So from that point onwards, and we're talking 59 onwards, we stopped using yeasts for fermentation. We had an approach with no fining, no filtering of the wines. That was the approach that really my father wanted to follow. In the 60s, if you think of the evolution of wine, the chemistry of wine was being discovered. Yeah. Malolactic fermentation, the different types of fermentation, all of the chemistry in the wine was being discovered. Yeah. And so with discovery came, I guess, the human nature of trying to control things. And on the contrary, my father's approach was to be exactly the opposite, as in stay as natural as possible. And rather than continue or use these new techniques, is actually continue an old methodology, which was to make wines with no treatment at all, with no additives, with nothing, not even sulfur at the time. We actually do use a bit more sulfur now in levels that are considered organic levels, so extremely low, because our wines need to travel around the world, so they need to be stable enough. But apart from that, there are absolutely no additives. And so his approach has always been, he called that non-interventionist in a way, because it meant that he was not adding anything. Now, there is always intervention, because you do choose which varietals to plant, where, when do you harvest, when do you rack, what do you do, what are the processes, which containers do you use when you're making the wine. So there is some form of intervention, but Serge, my father, used to call it no intervention, because he was talking mainly about not adding anything to the wine that should not be there. And that was from a movement that he got from the 60s, way before, the word organic existed or natural wine existed as a term. That was his approach.
And as you alluded to, that was a time period where it was like the beginning of the heyday of wine wine science ultimately, right? So stainless steel fermentation, inoculated yeast, all of that. And your father studied with Émile Pénaud, who is one of the foremost wine kind of wine professors and winemakers of that time period. So your father understood how all of that operated, and he knew that world well. And what's great about it is like, no, I'm just going to go with my own approach. It was really great. So
yeah, there's an interesting story maybe I should share here.
Yeah.
So yeah, as you said, my father studied with Émile Pénaud and Jean Ribeiro-Gaillon, actually, who was also one of the big teachers at the time, mostly focused on the chemistry, on the chemical side. At one point, Émile Pénaud actually came to meet my father at one of his booths, I think 10 years or 15 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And he tasted the wines, really enjoyed them, and congratulated my father. And then my father told him, I must admit something, Mr. Pénaud. I actually made the wines in the exact opposite way of the way you taught us. And that's where Émile Pénaud actually had an amazing answer, which was to say, Mr. Hochar, we needed to give you knowledge, and you needed to have know-how. And this is the difference between knowing, I guess, the chemicals, the chemistry, all the techniques that goes into winemaking, what's happening effectively in your fermentation tanks, what's happening in terms of processes. But then know-how is crucial because it means that you need to know as a winemaker what is adapted to your terroir, what is adapted to your heat environment, what is adapted to your altitude, to your taste. You know, how do you perceive wine and taste? And this becomes really the signature of the winemaker and his contribution. And so, yeah, the difference between knowledge and know-how.
I love that. That's great. I have it written down now, so I will not forget it. So one of the things which is really, there's lots of things that make Chateau Musar stand out. But one aspect is the blend of grape varieties that go into Chateau Musar Rouge and also Chateau Musar Blanc. What drove your father to work with those grape varieties? What was the magic that happened in his mind with those three or those five?
Yes. So maybe let's start with the reds. When my grandfather started the winery, Lebanon had sustained, I guess, phylloxera, had suffered from phylloxera. And as far as we know, there were no red varietals left that would be suitable for making wine. So I guess given the influence that he had and coming back from France, and because we spoke French, he turned to French varietals and planted those in the Bekaa Valley. So we're talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, Carignan, Cinsault. And so his influence was probably a bit of Cabernet because he was close to Ronald Barton from Chateau Léoville-Barton. And maybe that explained maybe the influence of getting the Cabernet. But then because he knew that the weather was warm, there was more heat than in Bordeaux, he needed varietals that would resist a bit better to heat, and therefore decided to go also for varietals from, you know, Rhone and southern France. And hence probably the inclusion of Cinsault, of Carignan as well. And I think there were other varietals, but eventually when my father took over, he narrowed down his blend in terms of his taste and his perception of what would be a good expression of Lebanese terroir through to these three, Cabernet Sauvignon, Carignan, and Cinsault, with roughly a third of each. And he also developed his technique in terms of how long do you keep your wines in vats, what type of containers. We use cement vats because we feel that, again, in terms of his non-interventional philosophy, he wanted to have a container that was the most neutral possible. And cement is more neutral than stainless steel that was being, I guess, used from the 60s onwards. And so this approach of making this blend, deciding to blend only after 2 years, So for 2 years, actually, each varietal is kept separate, each vat is kept separate, until we feel that we understand the component and the contribution of each single varietal for that specific vintage. And then we blend. So we blend with a bit more knowledge than having a field blend that would be done after, let's say, 2 weeks or 3 weeks. Once we've blended at year 2, the wines go back into cement vats for another year, and then we bottle at year 3. For the whites, we use local varietals. So when my grandfather started, Obeide and Marwah, these 2 white varietals, have existed in Lebanon for ages. They are probably the varietals that existed when the Phoenicians were producing wines. And so we did not need to plant anything. So we used those to create our whites, and we still produce today. We're the only producer in Lebanon to use both of them. We've been using them for almost 90 years. And now with, I guess, the advent of a lot of wineries and interest from consumers for local varietals, there's a plethora of new wineries also that are following what we've done and using some of these varietals that are local specifically to Lebanon, Obeide and Marwah. But you know, we've managed to show that these varietals can produce wines that age 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years.
So it's one thing that it's almost impossible not to talk about, and in bringing in talking about Chateau Musar and Lebanon itself. Could you talk about the war years between 1975 and 1990, and really how the decisions your father made as far as keeping all of the employees there, as far as like, we're going to make a wine no matter what. Kind of, it's really, particularly in times like we are right now, it's one of those stories I keep on going back to for my own inspiration, and something that always has inspired me, but particularly in times like these, I think it is really one of the great and most beautiful stories in the wine world.
Yeah, no, the war in Lebanon was a long war. It started in 75, finished in 91. We at the time, because of the distance between the vineyards and the winery, it created additional issues compared, I guess, to a normal war zone. Because not only did we have to deal with, I guess, war happening around, but we need to deal with transport as well. So in 76, the first year really of the war, first thing that runs out in a war is typically fuel. And so we could not transport the grapes from the vineyards to the winery. So no production of 76. After that, you're 77 onwards. By then, you know, even in difficult times, you know, you always manage. We've been used to adversity, so we always manage. So at the time, we started to figure out how to get fuel, how to get the trucks to cross through the different checkpoints, and eventually produced every year. Every year, obviously, there was an impact. So a vintage like 83, we could not have the grapes cross towards the winery in September, which is the normal harvest period, but the roads only opened in October, which meant that we harvested a month late. But we were very lucky with a great summer, no rain until October, until harvest time. And so we had a fantastic vintage, a bit more ripe, a bit more sweetness, but an amazing vintage in 83. Same thing in 84, we harvested a month late, except that in 84, again, that's part of the stories, I guess, that we have at Musar. Yeah. Instead of taking 3 hours for the trucks to arrive from the vineyards to the winery, it took 5 days, because the trucks, one of them actually made its way through to the southern part of Lebanon, took a boat to go up north to reach the winery. Another one went north and then came down, and both of them arrived at the winery after 5 days. Which is, you know, I call this vintage our truck fermented wine. It behaved like a Madeira in its first 10-15 years. It eventually moved on to be a bit more like a port. it's a vintage because of its features that we did not release for a very long time. But eventually, after 30 years, we realized that it was a vintage that came back to wine. So we started releasing it actually in 2015, 30 years after its vintage. And I've had the opportunity actually to taste it with Bolu as well. You open a bottle of 84, it starts off as a port almost. And as you decant it, you wait for an hour, it starts to open up, acidity starts to pick up. The port aromas that you have typically on it from this beginning or opening starts to dissipate, and after an hour you have more and more of a wine, and it goes through so much change. And it's a real testament to, I guess, the raw nature of our wines and to life, because it's a wine that's gone through hell almost and then survived. And today it's one of our most wild wines, but it's a wine, and it's a beautiful testament to survival, especially, as you say, in these testing times.
Yeah, I'm very fortunate. I was able to try it as well, the 1984, and it really is one of those. When I think of Chateau Musar and older vintages, it's like tasting a snapshot of history. It's like what that year was like, it's like smelling and tasting what that year was like. Right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very, very that wine is very memorable across the board. So we should probably start talking about some of the specific wines here a little bit. Number one is the Jaune Rouge, and could you kind of tell us how the Jaune wines came about?
Yes. So wait, you know what? Let me
great, the new label.
A picture, because that will help with. Let me just get it. Okay. Voilà. So I hope you can see this. It's not a huge picture, but so this is our Jaune wine range. Some people who are familiar with our Jaunes probably are not used to these labels. These are actually new labels that are coming up to the market this year. So it's 3 colors. Our Jaune white is a blend of Viognier, Vermentino, and Chardonnay. This blend was started roughly 15 years ago. We used to have Obeid and Miroir, which are the local grapes, into our Jaune white, but these local grapes tend to be or to create wines which are fairly austere when they're young. This is why we only released the Chateau white after 8-9 years. And so we decided to move the Jaune range, that is supposed to be more easier to drink, more accessible, more fruit driven, targeting an audience of younger people who are looking effectively for fruit, for freshness. And so we decided to change the blend 15 years ago, changed also the label that's a bit more, I guess, modern, and create this blend of Viognier, Vermentino, and Chardonnay. These are wines that are rich, they are, but still have a lot of freshness and fruit to them. And this is how we characterize the whole range, which does not go through wood. None of these wines actually go through wood. Okay. The rosé is a Cinsault and Mourvèdre blend. And the Jaune Rouge is made with the same philosophy as all of our reds, as in it's a blend of a few varietals. All of our reds actually have Cinsault in them, because this is one of the signature varietals of Chateau Musar. It's the varietal that brings, I guess, the elegant side to our wines, the more smoother, easier to drink, especially when it's younger. Type of approach. We also use Cabernet Sauvignon because we need structure. And so if you look at the spectrum of the more masculine varietal would be the Cabernet, the more feminine, elegant would be Cinsault. And these are the 2 ends of the spectrum. And then we add the third varietal to our each red wine. And in the case of the Jaune, the third varietal is Syrah, Shiraz. And so this Jaune will be a blend of Cabernet, Cinsault, and Syrah, unoaked, so to stay fresh and to stay really more fruit driven.
Yeah, and in tasting right now, the 2018 just came to the United States, and in tasting that just right now, it's really amazing the brightness of fruit that comes out, just like ripe red raspberry and red cherry and kind of like cranberry compote quality, but you still get the complexity, some of the complexity of Chateau Musar, right? You get those secondary aromatics, which really give the wine depth. And the Cabernet Sauvignon, the palate, that texture what it adds in the texture is amazing. So you have ripe fruit, you have tannin, and then you also have, I find, surprising acidity as well. And that must be testament to the Bekaa Valley and the cooler nighttime temperatures. Am I right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I think the components of fruits that you mentioned, like the raspberries and the cranberries, that is really the contribution of the Cinsault that tends to provide flavors associated with lighter red-colored berries, so like strawberries, raspberries, cranberry, compared to a Cabernet or Syrah, which tend to be much more peppery, much darker red berries. And so Cinsault is that contributor that which represents roughly 50% of the Jeune Red blend. Why 50%? Because this is how you produce a wine that is actually accessible and not too tannic when it's young.
And Cinsault is a grape variety, is one that's been planted since the 19th century in Lebanon, from what I understand.
Absolutely, absolutely.
A long history it has, or not. We're talking Lebanon, so not that long of a history. But in comparison to say like Cabernet Sauvignon or Syrah, it does have a pretty long-standing history in the country and has its own unique qualities, from what I understand.
Absolutely. And it resists, it's a bigger berry, so it resists much better to heat, because one of the major issues we've been dealing with, I mean, we talked about war, but one of the major problems that we're dealing with in Lebanon, and I guess across the world, is global warming. And so what we've seen is that we've been exposed to extreme weather patterns, whether it's extreme heat, which forces us in the summer to harvest earlier or to act differently compared to what a normal pattern of weather would have meant in terms of harvesting time. But we've also had years like 3 years ago where we had extreme frost in April, May, which was completely unusual for us. We were at -10 Celsius in the Bekaa Valley in April. And we had already buds that had started and we lost them. And so we lost 50% of the production. So that does have an impact. Clearly, global warming is having an impact. And the berries that resist the most are typically the larger berries. And Cinsault, from that perspective, actually allows a better resistance to heat.
Great. So what would you pair, or what would be two-part question? What would be kind of a traditional Lebanese dish that you would have with this? And then what's something non-traditional that you would have with the Musar Rouge?
Well, with the Musar Rouge, I guess it depends which wine you're having. If we're talking about the Chateau Red typically is a wine that when it's released at year 7 will be more fruit driven, a bit like the Jeune Red, but obviously with more complexity. And as the wines get older, whether they reach 15, 20, 25, 30 years, they move on more to earthy, tertiary aromas, more animal. And so with these wines, the age will have an impact in terms of what you're going to try to pair them with. If you're having a red meat that with a red sauce, which is maybe more fruit driven or has a bit more sweetness, I would typically go with a slightly younger wine. If you're having a game or a lamb or any meat dishes that tend to have a bit more of this animal and component to them and more earthy, I would then tend to go with a slightly older vintage, because that older vintage will tend to be more delicate, more complex, will have an array of aromas that are linked to earth that is much wider, and therefore can sustain effectively gastronomy, or in a sense of a dish that would have slightly more subtle flavors. in order to pair with the wine. Because I guess the issue with pairing is always a question of balance between wine and food. You don't want food that's going to be too powerful compared to the wine, and vice versa. You don't want a wine that's going to be too powerful to the point where it overwhelms the food. So getting that balance right is crucial.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're talking about subtle dishes, like gastronomy, which has a lot of different flavors, let's say, associated with one dish, then you want also a wine that has the ability to leave enough space for the food, and therefore wines that are elegant, that are complex, and not too powerful and not too overwhelming, and in that case, not too young also.
So in that case, with the Jaune Rouge, you because it is kind of fruit forward and a little bit more approachable, you have kind of a greater ability to adapt to some different foods, right? So you can have a dish with this wine that has some added spices to it, that has more
Yes.
more
power.
More power, more diversity of flavors across the board.
Correct.
Right, and this wine is really just delicious, and it's that perfect balance of kind of all the things you look for in a great not everyday wine, say like why not everyday wine, but like a great weekend wine, when you want to drink and have something delicious and just complex enough where you're thinking, right? So within that, let's go and talk about the Chateau Rouge, the 2013 vintage. And I have to say, one of my favorite times of every year is when the current release of Chateau Musar Rouge and Chateau Musar Blanc comes out. And I decanted this morning, double decanted it, and I've been taking kind of notes throughout the day. So it really is really one of the highlights of each year for me. So could you tell us about the wine itself, the vintage, and some kind of anecdotes about we just went into food pairing, but anecdotes about this particular year itself?
Yeah, so 2013 was a year. I'll talk about, I guess, the weather conditions, because it determines obviously a lot where the wines got to today. So 2013 was a year where we had good amount of snow, good rainfall. When we got to spring, the vineyards were extremely lush, very, very green. So we were very happy, expecting a good harvest in terms of quantities and in terms of qualities. And as is more and more the case these years, we were hit by a heat wave, middle of August. Usually we start harvesting around middle of August for the reds. And within 1 or 2 weeks, we were actually hit by a heat wave, which meant that all of a sudden, all of our varietals were roughly ready for harvest, were reaching the maturity. But so we ended up by having 2 teams working at the same time to harvest, because we had to do it fast. And the more you wait at this point in time, the more you lose, and you get overripeness, too much alcohol, too much sugar, too much alcohol. And so we ended up by having 2 teams working. The varietal that survived the best that year in terms of impact from the heat wave was Cinsault. Actually, we harvested Cinsault the last, almost at the normal time, whereas Cabernet, Carignan, Cinsault, Syrah, were harvested a bit earlier than usual. And so we ended up with a vintage that was a bit more Cinsault dominant, which means in Musar terms, a vintage that is a bit more elegant, more subtle, a bit more, when it's young, tilted towards lighter red berries. So not too many tannins when it's young, which means that the wines are actually ready to drink earlier, which since we were released at year 7, actually is good. And so 2013, for those of you who know our vintages, you might remember the 2010. 2010 also was a year with a huge heat wave, and where Cinsault did very well. And so we ended up with a vintage that was a bit maybe lighter in body, but ready to drink earlier and really, really smooth. And this is, so elegance is probably the word I would use for 2013.
So going into, and you and I've talked about this before, and you have a really great analogy with how Chateau Musar ages. And could you talk a little bit about the 3 stages of Chateau Musar, so and how they change aromatically through time?
Yeah. So exactly, it's always a question of, and I'm often asked, when should you drink Musar? When is the right time to open your bottle of Chateau Red? And so it's a question really of what you like. And for that, I'm going to describe what I call phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 that our wines go through. And then it's really up to every consumer to determine where he wants to drink the wines, or in which zone. So phase 1 is usually between time of release, which is 7 years, and let's say 10, 12 years of age. The wines will still show a lot of berries, red berries, red fruit, fresh fruit. So if it's effectively almost as if you're tasting the fruit from the tree when you're tasting in the wine. Mm-hmm. That is phase 1. Some vintages, will be a bit more fruit driven towards Cinsault types of fruit, so lighter red berries. Some others will be more darker red berries if we're talking about more Cabernet dominance, because the Cabernet, let's say, ripened better in a certain year. Mm-hmm. But you're always in these period, phase 1, talking about fresh fruit. Phase 2 is, you have to imagine that the fruit that was on the tree is now getting baked by the sun, the season is moving through, and you get to a phase where the wines are, and the fruit is almost getting cooked by the sun. It's getting stewed. So it's almost like jam. Not jam in terms of weight on the palate, but jam in terms of concentration of sugar, concentration of the aromatics. And that is phase 2, usually between 12 and 15 years of age of our wines. And then phase 3 is if you had that fruit that was on the tree at the beginning, fresh fruit, then it got cooked by the sun, that was phase 2. Then that fruit drops to the floor. It's starting to disintegrate and it sips into the floor. And that is phase 3 of the wines, when usually from years 15 to 18 onwards. Mm-hmm. Some vintages get there earlier, some faster. It really depends on the vintage. But from 15 years onwards, let's say, you are into tertiary aromas, game, forest floor, mushrooms, spices, chocolate, tobacco, all of these animal flavors also that kick in. And so when is the right time to drink the wines? It really depends what you like. It's up to each person to determine where they want to, what do they want to, taste in a wine, and therefore decide the age at which they drink them.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, because so many people think that they really, really love old wine, and then they taste it and they're like, oh, no, actually you prefer young wine. Then other people vice versa. But one of the things which is really, truly impressive about Chateau Musar is the library program that you have. And the fact that right now we have vintages available from 1996 to 2006 in the United States. And with any wine property in the world, that really does not exist. Chateau Musar, as I stated, it's one of my favorite wineries, the wine that got me into the wine business. So I've kind of went out of my way to try as many vintages as possible from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s. Have my daughter's birth year in magnums, all of that. And what you said is, it's perfect. It's exactly how the range of Musar is. And it's at the same time, you still have that nice ripeness of fruit as well. And that kind of continues on, I've noticed, on the palate through time too. So it's some wines as they age get kind of austere on the palate, whereas Musar still has that warmth, which it really stands out, I think, in the world of wine.
Yeah, so one of the, I guess I had a story of actually two members of the French Grand Jury who were visiting my father at the winery, and I think we're talking 30 years from from now, or 30 years ago, sorry. And they were tasting through the wines, and one of the things they were shocked about was the youthfulness or the youth of the older vintages. And their comment was, you know, as the wines got older, they seemed to get younger. Sometimes when they're young, they are tannic, they are a bit more tight, and they have maybe a bit less conversation. They're very straightforward. They have what I call the brashness of youth. But as they get older, it's like a living person. They have more stories to tell. You go through your life and you experience more things as a person. It's the same for wine. And as the wines develop and age, all of a sudden they have much more to say. And so this is why when we typically do our tastings, we taste younger vintages first, and then we move on to older vintages. You know, some other wineries do it the opposite because they believe that the younger wines are too intense and therefore will effectively overshadow the older vintages. In our case, yeah, maybe the younger wines are extremely intense, but the older ones are so much more complex that once you taste an older wine and then move on to a younger wine, what you realize is that the younger wine appears almost like fruit juice. Yeah. It seems so simple after having tasted an older vintage, even though it doesn't have the power of the old, of the younger wines. But these older vintages, with their complexity, just blow you away because they have so much conversation. There's so much going on, and basically, because of these layers and complexity that they have, they tend to trigger emotions. They make you think, they make you live through experiences because they remind you of things. And the more complex a wine is, the more it has the ability to actually trigger memory points, emotional points in your brain and your heart. And this is how you connect with the wine. This is how you live an experience with the wine. And this is the beauty about wines that have complexity. And that complexity often comes with age.
Yeah, beautifully said. So I have a question from Facebook, and that is, what is the average vine age for the Cabernet Sauvignon, Cinsault, and Carignan?
Okay, average, well, basically we've been planting and replanting and trying to expand our vineyards. The oldest vines we have are more than 60 years old on the reds. The youngest wines have been planted over the last couple of years. So the average would probably be around 25. What's more important also is the yield. Our yields are low. We're talking 20 to 30. So let's say on average of 25 hectoliters per hectare. And that is the yield on all of our reds, no matter which wine the juice goes into. So when we harvest, we do not know exactly or necessarily which varietal or which plot of land will go into which red wine, whether it's the Musar Jeune or the Hochar Père-et-Fils or the Chateau label. So the quality of the juice is the same across the board. The decision to put a certain vat or a certain varietal into one label rather than the other is really based on the flavor profile of the year, the balance that we can create of that wine that year. And so the quality of the juice is the same. And so when you're buying a Musar Jeune, let's say, it might be much cheaper than the Jeune, than the Chateau, but it's the same quality of the juice. It's just a wine that is made in a different way with a different objective of trying to keep it more fruit forward, more freshness. Whereas the Chateau will be creating wine that's made to age because it goes through wood and has a longer process before it's bottled. But the quality of the juice at the beginning is exactly the same.
So you bring up a good point, Hochar Père-et-Fils. Could you talk a little bit about that and kind of the when that started and about the wine itself?
Yeah, so Hochar Père-et-Fils is our single vineyard wine. It's a wine that is closer in style to the Chateau label, which is our top label, because it's a wine that goes through wood. Jeune was meant to stay fresh, targeting an audience of who's looking for, I guess, more fruit-driven wines, so no wood. Hochar Père and Chateau are wines that are a bit more complex, go through wood, and are made to age more. The Hochar Père has Cabernet and Sasso, like all of our reds, but with a third varietal, which is Grenache, that gives it its unique identity. It also happens to be a single vineyard. So it's really one specific village called Ana in the Bekaa Valley, from which we harvest all of the three varietals that go into the Hochar Père bottle or wine. It's so similar to the Chateau, we harvest and keep every vat separate for every varietal separate. We then, it goes through wood after a period of 1 year. That period of in wood is roughly 6 months. It's a bit shorter than with the Chateau wines. It's then blended, bottled at year 2, and then sold effectively 6 months later. So it reaches the market relatively faster than the Chateau. It's also bottled a little bit earlier, which means that it's ready to drink earlier. And this is why today we have a wine that is typically released between 2.5 and 3 years after the harvest. The Hochar has been produced since 1989. We started producing it for one specific retailer in the UK, Marks and Spencer. And it was so popular that when they stopped the line after a year and a half, we actually kept it. And so this is our single vineyard wine. I guess the younger brother of the Chateau in a way.
And then it's not made every year from what I understand, correct?
No, so it is actually, but what happens is that sometimes the production is small because it's linked to Grenache. Yeah. And so when the production is small, and this is why in the US we skipped 1 year, because we decided to, rather than spread the small production across the whole world and then move on after 3 months to a new vintage, that would be effectively too complicated. We decided to have one part of the world move to one vintage and one part of the world move on to the earlier or the younger vintage, to avoid a rotation that would be too fast for each market. That's all. But usually it's produced every year. But again, the quantities tend to vary, and so that is why there might be some skipped years in some markets.
Yeah, that's always a delicious wine, that balance between complexity and also nice, generous fruits as well.
Correct.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think we should go on and talk about the Musar Blanc, the 2012 vintage. Another wine which, quite honestly, I can't think of another white wine in the world which is like it. It stands alone. It really is. You can't really compare it to other things, right?
Yes, let me see if I can get some pictures, voilà, because that will give an idea. Voilà. And I'll share this picture with everybody. Voilà. So I guess it's interesting to share for a reason. First, if you look at the year, this is 95 vintage. Second, you look at the color. And this is not a sweet wine. This is actually a dry wine. So it's produced from Obeide and Merouah, these two white varietals that are specific to Lebanon. These varietals have unique features. They are harvested very late. They're actually harvested in October, way after the reds. They are harvested 2 months after our Viognier, Vermentino, and Chardonnay that we use in the Musar Jeune. And despite being harvested so late, they actually are only at 12 or 12.5 degrees of alcohol, which is, below all of the other varietals that are harvested earlier. So these varietals tend to survive well. They create wines that are extremely complex, and that they age also very well. The process is relatively easy. I mean, they are pressed, then fermented in wood, stays in wood for 6 months to 9 months, depends on the barrel, then blended, then bottled at year 1, and then they sit in our cellars for 7 to 8 years before we release them. So the current vintage will be now 8 years old. We're releasing 2012. It will not have this dark color that you see on the bottle now here of the 95, because when they're younger, they are a bit more crisp. Yeah, voila, that's a color that's actually, wait, let me stop sharing this. Voila, you can see your, voila. Here, the color is much lighter, yes. And so you'll be more maybe on peach, on lemon zest. And as this wine, so this wine is extremely peculiar. It needs to be really treated like a red wine. So you would need to serve it at cellar temperature, not too cold. It needs time to open up. Ideally, I would double decant it and let it rest a bit, keep it at cellar temperature, and then drink it after half an hour. And as the wine opens up, you move on maybe from the first impression of having a wine, maybe that is close to acetone, maybe when you're starting to open the bottle. And after half an hour or an hour, you're on flowers, jasmine, rose petals, orange blossom. And it's a wine that goes through an evolution that is extremely mind-blowing, because it just covers so much breadth over a short period of time. But these are wines that need this amount of time. It's not necessarily wine that you can open up from the fridge. If it's too cold, it will shut down. You really won't be appreciating it. So it needs the right temperature and the right time. And that's in the glass. And if you take that bottle of wine and decide not to open it today, but to wait another 5 years, the wines will move away maybe from these more citrusy or maybe exotic fruits that you have when they're young 8 years, huh? Yeah. Young by Musar standards, let's say. And then after 15 years, they are more walnut, honey, dried apricots. And eventually you wait another 5 years, they get to the color that I showed you of the 95. There you get to really much darker and more complex and also heavier wines. Maybe some would consider it an oxidized or oxidative style. So it might remind you maybe of sherry or maybe of whiskey. If you drink a 1975 white, it will move from sherry to Jerez to whiskey notes over a course of 2 to 3 hours. But although it has all of these aromas, it will never have the weight of sherry or the weight of Jerez, because it doesn't have the same alcohol levels. It's only 12 degrees of alcohol. So it's a really peculiar combination in terms of flavors versus weight versus, I guess, aromas.
And back to what you were talking about with, or what we were talking about with the Rouge, the vintages have different tastes and flavors as well. They are remarkably different. I was fortunate enough to try a 1972 and a 1986 Blanc and a 1991 last year as kind of one of my great wine tasting days, one of the best ever. Those wines were vastly different. The 72 was incredibly youthful still, with great fresh acid. The 86, same thing, and was not like sherry at all, was not super oxidative. But then other vintages within that did have that quality that you were talking about. So it's super fascinating, the whites and the way that they're just so complex, they're beguiling, right? And the 2012 is stunning. It has that combination of that ripe fruit. Now it's opened up. It was decanted earlier today, so it's really opened up, and you get that jasmine floral characteristic. It's like springtime, right? You get the right fruit, but then you get that slight kind of toffee, salted toffee note on there as well. And then on the palate, it's great refreshing acidity and ripe fruit, but also that salty component's there too. There's so much going on.
Yeah, it's a very peculiar wine also, because when it opens up, you get these aromas of jasmine, of rose petals, even orange blossom, and I don't know if you've had. I assume you've had Lebanese desserts. Lebanese desserts, they're all about this syrup, which is orange blossom with sugar, which is served on most of the desserts, Lebanese desserts, and our wines, as they open up 2012 after an hour, will have some of those components, which remind us bizarrely of the desserts that we get in Lebanon on the nose. And it's not because we put any orange blossom in it. It just happens to be the case. It's I guess a random lucky event. But when you get this sweetness on the nose, then you taste the wine. You taste the wines, and then you get something which is much drier, with a bit even of saltiness, as you mentioned. So there's a dichotomy between the nose and the palate, and it's that dichotomy that is interesting, intriguing, challenging, and that effectively leads you to open your mind about what to expect from wine, because you smell the wine, you expect something, you taste the wine, you get something completely different from what you were expecting. And it's good to have a wine that throws you off, because it resets all your, it forces you not to have any préjugés.
Preconceived notions.
Preconceived notions, exactly. You know, it throws off your world of what you expect, and all of a sudden you have to reassess everything and judge the wine on its own, and open your mind to, I guess, to new things.
Yeah, I love it. So as we're getting into kind of wow, it's a little over an hour. I can't believe that. I can talk to you forever and talk about Musar and other things, but I think we should bring in Bartholomew. And I think one thing that would be really cool for everyone watching is for you to share your favorite story about your dad, and for Bartholomew to share his favorite story about your dad. And I think that would be, I think everyone would love that. I know I would.
Yes. Favorite story. There's obviously there are a lot of stories about my father. A lot of them I know, a lot of them I don't know also. I guess this is what I probably would have to share. I'm sure Bolu has a story that I don't know, that he would maybe share. You know, in a way, what was always, I guess, as when you have a father and son relationship, there's always, some would argue, either a competition or like an interaction. And you know, as you get older, there's always a perception of, you know, how do you interact with as a father and a son. And so I've always, when I was younger, believed that I was fairly different from my father. And actually, when we tasted wines, we always had a different approach to tasting. I tended to like something which was a bit rounder, easier to drink. My father liked things which were a bit more complex, maybe even harder to understand. But I realized over time, you know, and as you get older and your palate, I guess you taste more things, you realize that you have a DNA. Every person has a DNA, and at some point your roots and your DNA comes back, and you realize that effectively you have much more in common with your parents than you thought when you were younger. And this is actually what I've discovered over time.
That's great.
But I think, Max, there's one thing we haven't talked about is arak. Maybe I should mention that.
Yep.
If we have a bit of time. So we also produce arak. Arak is a very traditional Lebanese spirit. It's a distillate of wine. So it's alcohol made from grape juice, distilled into, fermented into wine, and distilled 3 times. At Musar, what we do is we actually distill it 4 times to make the arak even smoother, the alcohol even smoother. The 4th distillation is made with anise seeds to give it this flavoring. It's an alcohol which is 106 proof. Yep. Once we've distilled it, it's typically more than 10 years of age alcohol. When we distill it the last time to sell it as arak with the anise seeds, we then leave it in amphoras of clay for 1 year so that all the sediments settle to make it even smoother and silkier. It's then cut to 106 proof. And when you drink it, traditionally you add 1/3 arak, 2/3 water. It turns milky white, and then eventually you add an ice cube as well. It's maybe an acquired taste. It's a very typical Mediterranean drink. For sure. Ouzo, raki, pastis are similar drinks, and arak is the Lebanese version.
And do you recommend it as an aperitif?
So you can have it as an aperitif. In Lebanon, with a traditional meal, you would have it during the whole meal. And you can also have it as a digestif as well. So it really depends. And you can also have it as an alternative to, let's say, to absinthe in alcohol in
Cocktail, yeah, in cocktails, it's great
in
for that.
cocktails. Yes, sorry, in cocktails, exactly. Because it has similar features. Maybe yes, similar features to the absinthe. Maybe with a little bit more of a hint of anise. But extremely smooth because of the decision by Musar to distill 4 times rather than 3. So a very interesting drink for those who like those types of flavors.
Yeah, no, it is really delicious. I enjoy it a lot. But Bartholomew, how about your favorite Serge Hochar story?
Well, I have so many because I've known him since 1979, but some of my favorite stories are the stories of other people reacting to him. For instance, I remember doing a tasting in New York, and this guy called Hago from, excuse me, from upstate, upstate Maine, in fact, Sorrento, Maine, came, sorry,
No problem.
I've drunk all my Musar. It's anyway, sorry about that. I swallowed something the wrong way. This guy, Hago, got up at 3 a.m. With 3 other people, and they all piled into their car and drove all the way down from Maine to New York. They got there just in time for the tasting because they broke down halfway and had to repair the car. But they got there like literally 5 minutes before this tasting with Serge Hochar. And the next morning they got back in the car and drove back. And it's that sort of passion that is invoked in people that people will are just completely passionate about Musar. And another great story of lengths of such lengths was Randall Graham, a great winemaker from Bonnie Doon in California. He caught the red eye one day to fly all the way to New York to have a meeting with Serge Hochar and flew back after the meeting all the way back to New York. And the topic of their meeting was to discuss what it would be if they planted vineyards in hexagonal shapes. And it was just so bizarrely intellectual that I love that sort of thing. But one of my own favorite stories about Chateau Musar is I was in Nashville at a winemaker dinner, and I was sitting next to this woman who said that she couldn't drink red wine because it gave her headaches. And her husband was a lawyer and said, yeah, she gets headaches and then she throws up in the middle of the night whenever she drinks red wines. And I said, well, you know, unless you can't drink grapes, I don't think you'll have a problem with Chateau Musar because it's so natural. There's nothing added to it. What's making you throw up is some other additive that's being put into a wine from, say, California or something. But Chateau Musar, they don't add anything. So I just don't think that'll happen. And don't sue me, but if I'm wrong, but I suggest you just taste it and see. If you can't drink this wine, then you know you can't drink any red wine. And so she drank a glass and she liked it so much she drank a second glass. And the next morning, the lawyer, her husband, rang me and said, I've got some good news and bad news. The good news is that my wife didn't have a headache and she didn't throw up. The bad news is that she now likes that expensive wine.
That's great.
Very good stories.
Yeah. And Marc, real quickly, before I forget to bring it up, and it's a great question for both you and Bartholomew. As from Bartholomew's stories and from your stories, Musar is such an iconic winery, and I've always wondered, when will a book come out, right? And it is right there in Bartholomew's hands, and that is the book. The book is out.
It's a beautiful book. I was just looking. I got it like literally 3 days ago, and I was looking at as Marc was talking, and it's a beautiful book. It's got beautiful photographs and stories, and it's got the Elizabeth Gilbert from the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love. She writes a chapter in there about Musar. It's a really fantastic book. Unfortunately, it's not available yet. It is in Europe. In England, you can order it from the Académie du Bain website, but it would cost a lot to ship to America. But we will have it available mid-May on our broadbent.com website, and you can order it then. But if you want to just send me a private message on my own Facebook, Bartholomew Broadbent, just a personal message saying to contact you when it is available. I will just contact everyone who does that. I played a funny trick on my mother-in-law last weekend. I was talking to her on a Zoom call with the rest of the family, and I set her alarm off. So I'm going to say, Alexa, set the alarm for 8 p.m. And anyone who's got Alexa on right now will have their alarm set for 8 p.m. to remind them to go online and order some Chateau Musar.
Well, maybe Alexa will understand also that she can order directly.
Yeah.
You never know.
It's funny. I did that for her. Her alarm went off in the middle of when she was having cocktails with some people. It was really funny. But anyway, hey Marc, it's been fantastic listening to you. I always learn something new. I always thought that the reason that your grandfather put the winery in the castle the other side of Beirut and not in the Bekaa Valley was because Syria had a history of being invaded, and if they invaded, they didn't want to lose the vineyards and the wine. At least they still had the stocks of wine if they ever got invaded. Is that not true?
It's a combination of many things. It was first the availability of this Musar castle, where that my great uncle had, so the cousin of my grandfather, and also the fact that he decided to put the vineyards in the Bekaa was that it was the most adapted terroir to have the grapes, and he wasn't sure also at the time whether Lebanon, which was new at the time, he started the winery in 1930. Lebanon was born in 1920. He wasn't sure whether Lebanon as a country would survive politically, militarily, as a unity, because it was a combination of the different regions with different religions. And so that was a big question mark. And so in his mind, he was more at ease putting the winery itself in the area that he knew well, which was the Christian area, even if the vineyards were located in the Bekaa Valley, which was an area that was not typically, there was a mix between, different religions over there.
I think one of the most surprising things you put up was that picture of the valley with the mountains behind, because so many people think that Lebanon is an arid country. They don't realize, if you go into the mountains over into other countries, it's very arid and dry, but Lebanon is a very beautiful valley, and it's between two mountain ranges. And I think that photograph was fantastic to show that you can go skiing, and you have skiing in Lebanon, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely, yes.
And then you have 300 days of sunshine. It's just an amazing country, and the food. If you ever go to Lebanon to visit Chateau Musar or just go to Lebanon, the beauty of Chateau Musar is that it's designed and it's sort of been brought up to go with Lebanese food. And if anyone who's been to a Lebanese restaurant in America will see there's a vast array of foods, but they don't realize that it's only about 10% of what we get. In Lebanon, you get so much more. And if you have a table, if you have 4 of you having lunch, you'd need a table that usually would sit 8 or 10 people, because they bring all the foods out at once. And so you have an enormous array of flavors. And so you need a wine that can go with everything. And really, Chateau Musar is that wine. You can have the red Chateau Musar with salmon, or you can have it with steak. You can have it with everything. And the white too, they're just enormously versatile wines.
Correct. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And also, I don't know if you spoke about the fact that you can keep Musar open. If you open a bottle of Chateau Musar, the red, you can keep it open for 5 days without a problem. Whereas, if you open most red wines after 2 days, they're pretty going downhill. And then the whites, your father always said that you could open a bottle of Chateau Musar Blanc and have a little glass every day for a month, and you'll see it evolve and become more interesting and just develop. So back in October, I opened a bunch of white wines and red wines, which the publisher, Stephen Spurrier, had asked me to taste for the L'Académie du Vin book. And so I opened them all, and I decided to test the theory. I poured a glass, and I didn't just leave bottles open with the corks in. I also poured a glass, and I put a cup over the glass to stop dust getting in. And I kept them, and not every day, but every week I would taste them. And finally, it was about end of March, I decided, okay, these wines are still fantastic, and they've been in the glass for 5 or 6 months. And I eventually I was running out of space, so I had to wash the glasses and get rid of them. But you can keep a bottle of white Musar open for a very, very, very long time. It's already got its own defenses against oxidation, I think.
That's a fantastic story. Yes, that's the bizarre and weird things that happen with our whites, is that this ability actually to hang on and stay, and age in the glass, not necessarily only in the bottle. That's quite surprising.
Well, Marc and Bartholomew, Marc, I know it's quite late for you, and you've been so kind with your time, and we really appreciate it. It was an honor for me to talk to you and to talk about Chateau Musar. Bartholomew, likewise, great to see you. Keep drinking Chateau Musar. It's one of the treasures of the world.
Max, can I just mention one last thing?
Of course.
Because I know that we mentioned when we talked about all the vintages that are still available in the US. Maybe there's one recommendation I can add, I guess, to viewers and suggest, is that when you are opening all the bottles of Musar, it's better to use prongs. I don't know if any of you are familiar with these openers, but sometimes what happens is if the wine is 20 years old or more, the cork might get stuck to the glass, and when you're pulling it out, you might break it. So we definitely recommend using prongs to open them. There's a lot of information on our website, and there are actually 2 tutorials that we've made that you can find on YouTube. If you just Google Chateau Musar, a guide to decanting, or Chateau Musar, a guide to wine openers. And on YouTube, these 2 videos will show you how to open old bottles using prongs, and also how to decant in order to get rid of sediments, because our wines will throw sediments after 15 years of age because they're not filtered or fined, and so you need really to get rid of that sediment. So there's again a lot of information on our website for these videos, and tasting notes on every single vintage, and also obviously in the book itself there's we made sure that there was a tasting note that was recent, so that it was either made by Jancis Robinson, by Bartholomew, by Stephen Spurrier, for most of the vintages that we've had, and they were all tasted either between 2018 and 2019. And so again, they're available on the website, on the book. Actually, on our website, you can also purchase the book as well. So hopefully that will be something that will allow our viewers to have more information if they need to. But thank you very much for having me. That was an amazing experience. Thank you very much, Bolu, as well, and to your whole team for setting this up.
Well, thank you, Marc. And actually, before you leave, we have one more question that just came in. What is the best time of year to visit Chateau Musar in Lebanon?
Well, I guess any time is right. The only time I would not recommend would be Christmas, because usually you have a lot of inflow of Lebanese living abroad who come for Christmas for 2 weeks. So they come and leave within 2 weeks. It's extremely hectic. All the rest of the time we're open. We were closed, obviously, in the last month or so because of the virus issues. But we're opening up this week again, hopefully in Lebanon. So yes, you can come anytime. Anytime is good.
Is it safe right now? The riots in Tripoli, are they affecting Beirut or?
No, I mean, well, Lebanon obviously now is going through a crisis, an existential crisis in terms of the economy, politically, at every level, and obviously with the virus as well. So it's not an easy time, but I guess nobody's traveling anyway. But as soon as things settle down in terms of opening up restrictions on transport and on flights, we should be ready to receive you in Lebanon, and it should be more than easy for people to come and visit, like they've done in the past.
And when will you be next in the US?
Depends on restrictions. I'm planned to be in October. April, my trip in April was cancelled. October, we'll see. I guess it depends on whether things are already open or not. I hope I'll be able to make it like every year in October. That would be actually something to look forward to again. So, and then I'll see you again, Bolu. That will be the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that will happen, and we will see you in October. Thank you so much, Marc. Thank you so much, Bartholomew.
And I'd like to just, also give a shout out to everyone who I saw a lot of our distributive partners watching, from Maine to California, and also a shout out to all the restaurant workers who are having tough times at the moment. Our chapeau to them, and hopefully we'll be back in business and drinking wine in your establishment soon.
Yes.
I'll drink to that.
I'll drink to that as well.
Yes.
Cheers to everyone. And please join us tomorrow. We have Iduna Weinert from Bodegas Weinert joining us for Bottles Up tomorrow at 5:00 p.m. Eastern Time. So if you're around.
She is such fun. She's a hoot. I know, Marc, you know her as well, don't you?
Absolutely, absolutely.
She's great fun. Okay. And well, I always describe her wines as the Chateau Musar of Argentina, because they similar philosophy of keeping the wines back a long time and releasing them late. So
yes.
Be a fun comparison.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marc.
Take care. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Max.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marc. Ciao.
Thank you.